My guest today is Greg Lukianoff. He is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and along with Rikki, Schlott, is the author of The Canceling of the American Mind. Cancel culture undermines trust, destroys institutions, and threatens us all, but there is a solution. And he is apparently the sole winner of the Playboy Foundation Freedom of Expression Award.
Woohoo!
Congrats on that, Greg. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too.
What do you? Okay, we're mostly going to talk about your book, but
Yeah.
I've never been invited to any Playboy events, so I'd like to know what is the Playboy Foundation Freedom of Expression Award, and did you get to go to the mansion?
So the reason why I did get to go to the mansion, but I didn't get to go to one of the fun parties. So Christy Hefner, Hugh Hefner's daughter, ran the foundation that Hugh Hefner set up, and for years they'd done a Playboy First Amendment Award, and it was only in 2007 that they changed the award to the Playboy Freedom of Expression Award, and I'm the only one who won it, which is pretty cool. They made it sort of like a single. They used to give 4 awards. They gave a single award back in 2007, and it was definitely it was a shot in the arm that I needed at the time. This was right around the time I got suicidally depressed, so it was kind of nice to get some recognition right around then. I did get invited to the mansion, but I saw an old journalist, talking about this, and he would complain about, why don't I get invited to the cool parties? Because these are the more highbrow things that Playboy would do.
Uh-huh.
So I never got invited to one of the bawdy parties, but I did get to. I got chased by an African swallow at the Playboy mansion.
That's okay. Great. Well, let's hope that you also, New Year's coming up. Let's hope that you get the annual Playboy twerking award on TikTok or something, and you get invited to the body one. But congrats on the free expression, and that flows nicely into your general oeuvre, which is protecting free expression, protecting freedom of speech. You were gracious enough to come on the program previously to talk about your last book, the coddling of the American mind, and now you have the canceling of the American mind. So I'll kick it off with this question. You assert in your book that we shouldn't think of cancel culture as a moral panic, which is how we normally do it. We ought to think of it more as a dysfunction of society. Why is that?
So we try to achieve 3 primary things in canceling the American mind. First, prove that it's real, which seems ridiculous that we would have to, but also quantify it and show that it's up there with a lot of the great mass censorship incidents in American history. I'm also doing this in somewhat more detail on my Substack, The Eternally Radical Idea, and explaining this. But part 2 is about trying to get people to rethink what cancel culture is. That essentially we make the argument that cancel culture is just the meanest way of winning arguments without actually winning arguments. And to think of it as part of a larger kind of system of dysfunctional argumentation that social media has helped make sure is everywhere. So we talk about the perfect rhetorical fortress on the right, the idea that kind of academia and academics have developed this really intricate way to not listen to each other's arguments, and we call it the efficient rhetorical fortress on the right, which is a relatively simple way to not have to listen to experts, journalists, and if you're very very MAGA, to not listen to people who don't like Trump. So and the reason why we present it that way is just to talk about how we'll never get towards truth arguing in this BS way. If basically your argument, someone says, I think we should have taxes should go up 3%. And someone says, you're a bad person because of this tweet that you had 20 years ago, is kind of the way we debate now. And it's okay, nothing about him being a bad person means he's wrong about his policy.
Yeah. Wait,
so,
can I give you an example? I did a video a few years ago with Reason that I'm sure you're familiar with. We did one called, I think, Libertarian Game of Thrones, which was very popular. It was very funny. It was very well done. And my favorite comment in the YouTube section was, "This is 0% funny. Libertarians are racist." And I was like, well, even if I was racist, I could still be kind of funny. Like, it doesn't preclude, like, you can have good comedic timing and be a bigot. Like the logic of this is running against the sort of inherent nature. But I agree with you. It's something deeply, deeply frustrating of this kind of epistemological and argumentative structure that we have in modern society of my goal is to disqualify you.
Yeah.
The goal is to figure out how the thing that you're saying that's irritating me is somehow racist or somehow
Yeah.
and once I'm able to make that clear connection, I have accomplished my goal and we can move on rather than actually tackling the issue and be able to have good arguments.
Yeah, and the perfect rhetorical fortress chapter was kind of cathartic for me, like laying out the dysfunction. Because first we talk about what we call the minefield, the way that like both sides are and not just both sides, everybody uses lazy ways to get out of arguments, and those are all just the standard logical fallacies.
Right.
Then we move on to what we call the minefield, which is the ad hominems that both sides use. So like accusations of bad faith. Everyone's a grifter, and we also introduce a new term which we really like. Hypocrisy projection, which is this happens to fire all the time, by the way. There'll be something in the news, about someone on the left or the right getting in trouble. And very quickly, you get people saying, "Where's fire on this case? I bet they won't take it." All this kind of stuff. And oftentimes, we're actually literally quoted in the thing that they are retweeting. Like we're in that article, or this document, by the way, was produced by a FOIA request by Fire. Like, about this case because of us. But hypocrisy projection is a situation in which someone who only cares about one side of the political fence immediately assumes everybody else is the hypocrite without actually seeing that maybe it's you. So we get this from both sides. We get a little more from the left, but also sometimes from the right. It was kind of nice. I was like, "Where were you on the Ayaan Hirsi Ali case in 2014?" And I'm like, "Okay, this is pretty funny because most people would, they'd be like, 'What are you talking about? That was 10 years ago.'" And I was like, "Here's my article in the Huffington Post about it, actually, and three, it's like three reasons why Ayaan Hirsi Ali should not have been deplatformed."
Well, can I back up a little bit? You used two
Sure.
terms, perfect rhetorical fortress and efficient rhetorical fortress. Can you elaborate on what that means and the difference between the two?
We talk about rhetorical fortresses as being ways to not actually have to address your opponent's argument, usually based in ad hominem about the speaker, but not exclusively. And the perfect rhetorical fortress is the one that I've seen grow up on the left, and it's beautiful in its own bizarre way, because it has so many ways to win arguments without winning arguments, and as we say in the book. And of course, step one, both on the right and the left, is I declare thee a conservative, or I declare thee a wokester.
Right.
And I'd say it that way because I don't want people to be under the impression that's like, oh, that just disqualifies the 36% of the population that self-identifies as conservative. It's like, no. In a recent article by Marianne Franks, she decided to up the accusations against people who believe cancel culture are real, which she believes. And this is a well-respected First Amendment professor, which is one of the reasons why I'm not just bringing up someone who nobody listens to. And she upped the temperature to. She'd previously written an article with that doesn't cite a single actual legal case in the UVA Law Journal.
Nice.
Saying that cancel culture isn't real, but basically, I think just because it's not, it is more or less her argument. And it's a right-wing plot. But in her more recent article, had to up the temperature because apparently people weren't listening if you just accuse them of being right-wing. Now we're neo-Confederates is the new term. And guess who our ranks include now? The New York Times and the ACLU, because they've both recognized that cancel culture is real, and they both
when I think of Confederate rags, the New York Times springs to my mind. When I think, if you could take the Stars and Bars and convert it into some pulpy paper, what would it be? The New York Times.
And that's just step one of the perfect rhetorical fortress. Because basically you can accuse anybody of being these things, so they don't mean anything. But the embarrassing thing is, how effective this is, particularly on the left. And I remember, starting at Stanford back in '97, that there was this kind of thing. If you declared someone right wing, you didn't have to take them all that seriously anymore. You didn't have to really, and you probably, shouldn't read Thomas Sowell. Or I always, make the point that people had convinced me that Camille Paglia was some crazy right winger when she's whatever Camille Paglia is. She's her own person for sure.
Well,
And
and I've read some of these like open letters from students to the university, and it usually, in the ones I've seen anyway, will use phrases like uh, "well-known fascist X" or
yeah,
"established racist X," and like just out of nowhere, we'll just make this pronouncement from a kid that probably doesn't know anything about the person, but you can really play fast and loose with the. All of the moral authorities in the heavens and earth all agree that this person's a fascist, and it's like, why?
yeah.
Well, like, 8 years ago, I saw him with a Dan Quayle bumper sticker on his car, and that was sufficient for me.
He's how is he a fascist? He's a libertarian.
Yeah,
You lost me.
yeah. He wants
Like,
he's a pacifist that believes in limited
yeah.
government and markets. Yeah, there's a lot to do with Hitler there.
Son,
Yeah.
do you know what that word means? Is kind of what you want to say. And that's just step one in the PRF. Then you get to the demographic funnel, where essentially, and we give examples of this, where it's kind of like, you shouldn't have an opinion because you're white. You shouldn't have an opinion on this because you're a man. You shouldn't have an opinion on this because you're cisgendered. You shouldn't have an opinion on this because you're straight. And we work through the demographics on that, and we work out that when you do the cross-referencing of all this, you're left with about 0.9% of the American population, that should be unimpeachable. But then guess what? It was all a game. Because even if you're in that 0.9%, and we have a great quote from a trans woman saying, okay, I know that we go through this whole exercise, but at the end of it, if I have the wrong opinion, then I have internalized transphobia. Camille Foster, points out that, being accused of having internalized racism. My wonderful co-author Rikki Schlott talks about how she's constantly being accused of having internalized misogyny, which is like a very kind of like standard accusation to make these days. And Coleman Hughes has this great quote about saying that I'm often told that the most important aspect of my for my opinion on certain matters is the color of my skin. But then when I have the wrong opinion on it, I'm told I'm not really black.
Yeah,
and this is something
it's almost like it's been weaponized to disqualify opinions we don't like that buck a narrative that's beneficial to our policy goals.
Exactly, and that's how you know it's about protecting dogma. It's not actually about protecting groups. And by the way, we followed this up. We asked basically every black conservative author that we knew, if this had happened to them, and a number of moderates, including people like John McWhorter, Coleman Hughes, of course, and Wilfred Riley. Every single one of them said they've been told that they're not really black for an opinion they have, and oftentimes by white people. And it's like, okay, well, that's perfect. There's no way to win under these scenarios. You're not even trying to argue for truth anyway. And by the way, we're only on step 6 of the perfect rhetorical fortress. I think at that point, there's still 8 more to go.
Yeah. Do you know Jonathan Rauch at Brookings?
Well, John Rauch is a good friend.
He's been on the show once previously. He's a really, really nice guy. I like him a lot. I think he's a great dude.
Yep.
And one of the things that I got when I interviewed him was he clarified for something that had been nebulous in my mind, where if you're invoking identity in an argument, it's good if you're doing it in order to add information to the argument. So if you and I are arguing about something, and I theoretically go, Greg, you're a straight guy, I'm gay, I am seeing things about this that you're not seeing that I would like to share with you because maybe you don't have access to that data. That's fine and needed and welcome. That's very different than I'm going to shut down the conversation based on identity. I am gay and you are not, therefore you're not allowed to talk about this anymore. I've got a button I can hit, and that's deeply illiberal.
Well, here's like the funniest version I've gotten that this week. Someone actually responding to something I tweeted saying, "Please don't take offense, but I'm only listening to the citizens of Gaza right now." And I'm like, "I'm sorry, I made you read my tweets. Like, what exactly are you asking here?" Kind of like, and you do realize that you're restricting the people you listen to a very large number of people.
Well, when we get into the so the perfect rhetorical fortress is this kind of like Byzantine theology, angels dancing on the head of a pin, incredible Jesuitical leaps and bounds, but it's all through identity politics and wokeism in order to
But
knock out
also
anything we don't like.
there's the don't get angry step in there, which is essentially, I watched this happen so many times that if you're really frustrated with this and you kind of snap about it, then that gets used against you like crazy. This happened to Kyle Duncan. This had to Ines Cantor Freedom. And then, of course, the final one, if you've got nothing left, you'll see happen time and time again. Like when this happened to Nicholas Christakis at Yale, but it's happened in dozens of cases, and so much so we're sick of hearing it. When it's clear the school that's trying to punish this professor, for example, for speech has lost, darkly hint that there's something more going on, but don't say, nice. I can't say what.
Nice.
There's something else up.
And ominous undertones of, that guy, the dude that had the Dan Quayle bumper sticker, I like says some people are saying, that's.
I'm not saying he sank Atlantis, but there is Atlantis.
So, okay, so then what is the efficient rhetorical? So the perfect rhetorical fortress is this Byzantine theological...
almost beautiful.
Almost beautiful. It strikes me as deeply theological. My undergraduate was in religious studies, and I look at it and I'm like, oh, congratulations, you've brought back medieval theological academies, only they don't violate separation of church and state. That's actually a very clever move. Good job. If we shift over to the efficient rhetorical fortress, what is that?
Yep. Now, we've taken some flack for the fact that we take on both right and left with, I think, my old friend, Naomi Schaefer Riley, making it sound like we engage in mindless both-siderism in the book. It's like, no, there's 20 chapters on mostly threats from the left and 3 chapters on threats from the right. There is more cancel culture in general coming from the left by all of our research, that we will indicate. But about 1/3 of the punishments of professors do at least initially start in things like conservative media, and then next thing you know, professors getting punished because he embarrassed the school, and something that got revealed by Todd Starnes or something like that. Now, to be fair, the people usually actually making the final calls to punish that professor are often on the left, since that's the supermajority of administrators. But still, we call that out, and we talk about ways that people on the right disqualify speakers. And the fastest way, of course, is IW woke or liberal or socialist or like whatever. And I've seen that happen to some real staunch conservatives over the years, where it's kind of like, oh, you're magically now you're woke. You see this on social media. And then, of course, so it's, are you a liberal? Are you an expert? Are you a journalist? And are you critical of Trump? That's the most extreme one. And I know, I know this from experience, but we get orders of magnitude more hate mail from the right for coddling of the American mind than we get for the left.
Really?
Why? Because we're critical of Trump in Charlottesville. And we wrote something explaining why, no, we weren't actually wrong on that, and here's why in Persuasion. And we repeat some of that again. But yeah, we've definitely run into that, and it's not an argument, it's an argument tactic.
So the efficient rhetorical fortress is just a much more simplistic point and click ad hominem of you're of the wrong ilk, and therefore your opinions, I already know your opinions are wrong, and I know that they're in bad faith, so I'm not even going to engage you.
It allows you to disqualify an awful lot of people you probably should at least occasionally listen to. Now, to be fair, a lot of the book points out how experts have not really helped themselves and their credibility, particularly in the past several years. And also we actually really make the point that cancel culture destroys trust and expertise. Because if a professor is in a debate and suddenly when they get in trouble for the position they took, no one's going to trust you to be, fair on that topic ever again. And I always bring up the example of Carol Hooven at Harvard, who wrote a book called Testosterone. She's promoting it. She says we should be, compassionate to trans people. We should use their pronouns. We should, be as understanding as possible. But biological sex is real. And we can't pretend that it's not. And immediately it's actually a graduate student, but head of the DEI task force at Harvard, starts calling her out. Students start, boycotting her class. They won't actually be a TA for her, which that's something that I think Harvard should have come in and say, no, 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 we're not going to let students decide that we have to effectively fire this person. And she got support from professors like Steve Pinker, for example, but really not what Harvard should have come out and said is like, no, like we don't have orthodoxies here. And they should have done this, in a number of cases over the years. If they just actually said the right thing, it would have made all the difference. And she eventually, got extremely depressed and left Harvard. So she doesn't even count in our abysmal rating. That's really what Harvard got against their negative the score that they got on our campus free speech ranking. And that's a very sad case at Harvard, but it also undermines any faith that experts will be objective about this stuff. So the public isn't stupid, and they're watching this happen. Someone says biological sex is real and matters, and basically loses her job or feels forced out at minimum. When Scientific American comes along and say, by the way, biological sex isn't real, or at least it's on a spectrum, just like we think gender is, the public's going to be like, okay, well, here's the thing. The last person who disagreed with that
right.
lost your job. So why should I trust you on this again? Like, this just seems to be the thing that...
So yeah, no, this makes sense, and I like the institutional angle on this. So like during 2020, there was initially a protest group in Michigan that was protesting against the government for shutting things down. And the articles that came out were abysmal. The articles that came out were like, these people are willfully endangering lives and they should be denied medical treatment if they get COVID. Like, it was very, very strong animus towards them. Then the George Floyd protests happen, and there are, big outdoor groups that are meeting and they're line dancing and stuff. And I would watch people on TV go, well, racism is actually a pandemic too. And I would look at this and go like, oh, okay. So we're gonna there are certain things that are sacred that we can exempt from science is my read on that. And part of it is that there's a stick behind them where a lot of these people, if they really had their druthers, would have been like, yeah, we ought to be consistent, or we were wrong earlier, or no, they shouldn't be meeting outside or whatever. But they've got a loaded gun pointed at them, so they have to say certain things. And the general public has cottoned onto this and goes, well, I don't take your opinion seriously anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the it was very funny and but at the same time kind of sad to watch even some conservatives respond to the latest data on respect for higher education with, oh, this is just part of the right-wing plot to undermine faith in higher ed. And I was just like, dude, I've been doing this 22 years. Are you completely blind to how much like higher ed has done to undermine its own credibility?
Okay, so on that note, you mentioned at the top of our interview that the beginning of your book was just convincing people that cancel culture is real. This is a silly question, but I have to ask this because I live in media world.
Sure.
It is difficult for me to ascertain what is echo chamber noise that I'm getting, because cancel culture stories do very well in libertarian and conservative media. So can you give me numbers that would indicate that this is a accelerating phenomenon in the actual place it's taking, rather than just the stories proliferating or gaining volume?
Sure. Yeah. No. So we just came out with a study, indicating that almost 1 in 10, 9% of students say that they have been, investigated or threatened with investigation for their speech. That's usually a bias-related incident program thing. That for people who aren't familiar with like what the kind of numbers look like in free speech world, you're not talking about percent, like anything that gets you above like 1% in terms of people being punished. So 9% would effectively be about 1 million students in the country. It's even worse for professors. Professors, 1 in 6 say they've been investigated or threatened investigation for their scholarship, academic freedom, teaching related to their speech. 1 in 6, and it's higher for conservatives, unsurprisingly. Of the cases, so we know that we're only scratching the surface on the cases we know about. But of the cases we know about, and this is wildly, by the way, concentrated in the top 10 colleges in the country. The graph is like ridiculous when you look at it, like how much it's like, however many schools there is in the country, and it's the top 10 and top 100, account for almost all of them. And there, we've seen over 1,000 targeting incidents against professors, well over 1,000 at this point, since 2014. Our definition, by the way, of cancel culture is the uptick in campaigns to get people fired, censored, otherwise punished, expelled for speech that would be protected under the First Amendment, by which we mean, like under a public employee law, which we talk a little bit more in the appendix, like how much common sense that actually brings into the definition of what's kosher to fire someone for and what's not. And it's the uptick since 2017, accelerating in 2017. And so the numbers there that we know of, and again, like the other data indicates that this is just a drop in the bucket, is about 1,000 professors targeted, about 2/3 of them punished in some way, almost 200 fired. And to people who don't know a lot about this stuff, that's like, well, that sounds like not that big of a deal. No, are you insane? There were 3 professors fired over the 5 years and after 9/11 in response to their speech related to 9/11. And by the way, all 3 of those were actually fired for reasons that didn't actually affect academic freedom at all. Well, Ward Churchill was fired for gross academic misconduct, which he really did. Samuel Arian, one of the first people I defended early in my career, talk about an unsympathetic case, but that's the deal. You go on TV to defend.
That's how free speech rights work.
Yeah, that's how free speech works.
It tends to not be the sympathetic people that drive free speech. Yeah.
But it was my first time on TV, by the way, which was, as my friend said, you're not doing the Lord's work until you get hate mail. But he, like the real rap on him was that they were trying to fire him for a tape that got revealed from the 1980s where he said death to Israel. But really what they were trying to get him fired for was ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic Jihad. But they weren't willing to say that publicly. And then eventually he got indicted for it. And that's actually when they fired him. It's like, okay, you can fire someone for being indicted for being involved in international terrorism. And the final one was a professor who spent a substantial portion of her class talking about her opinion on the Iraq War and how it should be opposed, when she was actually a technical writing instructor at a technological college. And that's one where I initially, actually was very concerned about this case until I actually started to put together how much of her class she actually had devoted to something not related to the class. And I'm like,
so it wasn't a free speech issue. She was just a self-righteous and incompetent person. Even if I agree with her on
doing her job.
She was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that was considered a bad period for academic freedom. So effectively, kind of no professors were actually lost their jobs. Some were suspended. There was one, the guy who joked, anyone who could blow up the Pentagon.
Right. I remember that
my
guy.
Vote. Which was, by the way, my very first letter on behalf of a professor back when I started. He was forced out, but in a way that doesn't quite count as a firing. So 200 is unprecedented in any period since the law was established in the United States between 1957 and 1973, strongly protecting academic freedom. You have to go back to pre-academic freedom, pre-free speech law times to find numbers even in the ballpark. And by the way, that 200 professors is twice the number of the standard estimate of professors fired during McCarthyism.
That was the number in your book that blew my mind. That cancel culture, I think, is rightly defined by you in the book, is now had twice as many victims than McCarthyism, which is the bugaboo in the soul of the American spirit. When you think of censorship, you think of McCarthyism, but we are presently living in this weird kind of tepid sweater vest Maoism that is actually outpacing McCarthyism.
Yeah, and that's the thing you point out to people who want to dismiss this. So you think McCarthyism wasn't a big deal? You think 9/11 wasn't a big deal? Like in terms of like threats to academic freedom, because this blows those away. So having the data there, I think is helpful. There are people that can still never be convinced. And yeah, there was one thing that Adam Gurry said that blew me away, and I'm a big fan of his dad, Martin Gurry. But he said, on those kind of numbers, that in any other walk of life, that's a problem we would consider effectively solved. And it's like, what are you talking about? And so I've been doing a series on my Substack, the Eternally Radical Idea, which is a reference to free speech, pointing out, uh, 10 people were convicted under the Sedition Act of 1798. It's considered to be one of the great failures of
Yeah.
the First Amendment in American history. Are you saying no biggie because it was 10? Like, that's insane.
Well, plus there's
Meanwhile,
also like you could if we're talking about like I don't know ball bearings or something like a mechanical failure, then I'm like okay if we're talking about like a low percentage with a mechanical failure, but when you're dealing with people's livelihoods, there's a chilling effect. It's not just the people that are immediately affected; it's everybody else that's watching them going, oh, I better mind my p's
of
and
course,
q's. And I
yeah,
shouldn't
exactly.
think out loud anymore. We're told all the time we need to have a big important national conversation about X. But I'm afraid to talk. So I'm just going to sit back like that. There's a chilling effect from all that.
Well, and that's the thing is like on those kind of numbers, did people personally know a lot of the people getting in trouble under the Sedition Act? Probably not many overall, but they knew about it. And was that chilling speech? Of course it was. Like nobody wants to get arrested. And when it comes to when you're talking about 9% of students and 1 in 6 professors, that means basically everyone.
Those are students who feel they've actively been punished, not ones that just feel as though they are
No,
under.
no, they've been told that they've been threatened with investigation or actually investigated
Right.
for speech, and
Okay.
that's the same thing with with the professors. When you're talking about that, that means everybody knows someone this happened to, and this was something that I mean, I got really depressed writing this book. Like I was super anxious about it. I'm like, why am I putting a bigger target on my back? These people can be so incredibly cruel, and they'll find anything on you if they want to get rid of you. I'm like, why am I doing this to myself? But one thing that really made me feel a little bit better was going to a conference called Dialogue that had, that's great at having people all over the spectrum. And everybody was like, oh, thank goodness. Well, actually, it was more like, thank goodness you're writing this, as in like not me, but someone. This is happening to everybody, and like this is someone's got to actually talk about this.
You mentioned 2014 earlier. I think you said that there was an inflection
Mm-hmm.
point at 2014 and it accelerates 2017. The accelerant, I'm guessing, is related to Trump or that whole era, but 2014 is an inflection point. What is significant about that date?
We didn't cover what caused that quite as much because Coddling in the American Mind, my previous book, is all devoted to figuring out what was so weird about 2014. We might have stressed the fact that for a deeper dive into why that coddling is kind of like for that. And the best theory that anyone's been able to come up with, and even it sounds almost cliche at this point, but it's essentially social media is the thing that allowed cancel culture to really blossom in 2014. But there's something more to that. And one of the reasons why I'm so lucky to work with 23-year-old genius Rikki Schlott, young woman who I first started working with when she was 20. And in her case, she dropped out of NYU once it became $70,000 a year Zoom school. But she talks about the fact that she had a cell phone since she was 10. And this was, somewhat young even at the time. And what happened was when you give a bunch of, junior high schoolers technology that allows for greater sort of ways to relationally sort of show aggression, because one thing we talk about that's very clear in the science is that men show aggression social, like through physically, like we push each other around, we get in fights and all that kind of stuff, whereas women tend to actually do it socially, kind of like, oh, I hate Cindy and Cindy's no longer part of our group and whatever. And and so when I talk about it, cancel culture beginning in 2014, I love the fact that Rikki will often chime in and say it's like, well, but actually I grew up with it. Like we were sort of perfecting this cancellation technology as the first people to live in in a digital land and figuring out weaponizing against each other. And so I stress this to say that the cancel culture followed Gen Z. That essentially Gen Z starts hitting a campus in 2014. They've got this new way of fighting things out. It's terrible for free speech and it's great for conformity. Then you start seeing in corporations when around 2017, 2018, when Gen Z starts graduating. So it tends to sort of follow them along. Now, this is, but to be clear, administrators are facilitating it, they're encouraging it, and that's one of the reasons why it was such a disaster for free speech, is that a sort of a new group of students with a new way of sort of fighting things out meets administrators who have been pretty hostile to free speech in my entire experience, and kind of a disaster results. But I also emphasize the junior high school part because, in a very real sense, to the extent to which cancel culture is still very real, it means we're arguing like junior high schoolers.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I've done a couple episodes on this show on logical fallacies, and that was one of the things that blew my mind in college. I fortunately didn't have to take any math classes other than I think rational. I can't remember what it was. It was a logic class, and it went over logical fallacies, and I was like, oh great, I will attempt to banish these from my mind in order to better deal with things. And it does not seem to be part and parcel. I want to back up slightly further. You've been following this for 20 years. I think we're about the same age, but you would have more awareness of previous eras than I would, given that the realm you're in. I was born in '84. I vaguely remember in the 90s lots of talk of PC culture. We didn't have wokeness wasn't a term, or cancel culture, but there was PC culture. And it was, comedians seemed to think it was irritating. And then I remember it just kind of went away. So like, what's the difference between the spike of PC in the late 80s, 90s versus now?
I wrote about this in Reason, that essentially the first great age of political correctness was 1985 to 1995. And this is where the free speech movement, which started in 1964 in Berkeley, which was immediately followed by the anti-free speech movement, which began at UC San Diego with Herbert Marcuse in 1965 in a book called Repressive Tolerance, arguing for enlightened censorship of the so-called conservatives and the so-called right in order to, achieve utopia.
Yeah.
And the free speech movement really won. At first, it got to the Supreme Court within 10 years. Student rights were vindicated in two very clear cases. And 10 years after that, student surpassing was kind of shocking. It was a real change in balance in terms of like who was anti-speech. And that lasted until the speech code started getting shot down in court, until liberals and conservatives came together to say, this is ridiculous. Like, what are we doing? And by 1995, when what people thought was the last speech code was defeated at my alma mater, Stanford, 2 years before I got there, by the way, just 2 years, which blows me away. Nobody talked about it. There was a sense that, political correctness is now a joke. There was that, I always reference that movie PCU with Jeremy Piven. Professors and students seemed a little embarrassed by it. So there was this sense that it all passed and the fever dream was over. But the problem is, I started at FIRE in 2001, and what I discovered was that students were no longer into speech suppression. And the faculty was less, gung ho about it, but the administrators kept on plowing right along. And a lot of my career was saying, "Hi guys, actually, those speech codes we thought we defeated in the '90s, like 79% of schools have really bad speech codes. Some of them which are verbatim copies of ones that have been defeated in court, which is just completely insane." And that this is going to be bad. But so for about 20 years, I call this about maybe another 20 years, sort of the ignored years, where the media took its eye off the ball, and things got steadily and somewhat quietly worse. But people really started to notice when it wasn't just the administrators who were bad on this; it's when the students showed up and were bad on this as well, that all this blew up in 2014.
To change tack, I just saw a headline today that Alex Jones will be returning to X, the platform previously known as Twitter. If Elon Musk were to tap you as his right-hand advisor, he's going to do whatever you say. Is there anybody that you would ban from Twitter, or would you? How do you feel about that?
I definitely think the limitations on free speech make a lot of sense. The ones that are constitutional, for example, and those include, violent threats, like actually things that credibly can make someone think I'm going to kill you or hurt you. Mm-hmm. I think actually we should prosecute those more, because I think this has led to a situation in which people think oh, with that damn First Amendment, it means that you can issue death threats against people all you want. And it's like, it absolutely does not. And if people think that, it causes them to be less confident in the First Amendment. Another thing that it prevents is defamation. And I'm sorry, but like if you spend all your time and money trying to make the accusation that a bunch of these parents who lost their kids actually were paid actors, they didn't lose kids at all, that's defamation. That's gross defamation, and that's intentionally saying something that you know is not true. So I think that there was a better justification for kicking Alex Jones off of Twitter than practically anybody.
Okay, but you're citing specific things that are established in law in terms
Yeah.
of abrogating your ability to say anything. But in terms of just expressing opinions in general, you would use a very light touch.
Oh, absolutely. No, I offered to help Elon when he was first talking about buying X to say, or what Twitter, more easily explained, that yeah, we will help, and you should actually make reference to constitutional standards because they make a great deal of sense, and they actually, I when I speak in Europe about this, since they have a dim view of our free speech protections, and I have a dim view of their free speech restrictions.
Yeah,
I you know
I
I
agree. By the way, this is America. We got a lot of problems. We have the greatest free speech laws in the history of mankind. We have them
Yeah.
better than any country in the world. When I go to Britain or I go to Germany or something, they're like, "No, no, we believe in free speech. Just unless it's heinous or offends a lot of people, then it should be suspended." And I'm like, "You don't believe in free speech. You're an island of peasants that like submit to the czar. Like you don't have free speech. I'm sorry."
If the cops are arresting you for offensive comments on Facebook, which happens by the thousands in Britain, at least in recent years,
Yes.
the
I've seen billboards. There are billboards in Scotland right now that have friendly cops coming through a door that say, like
being
be
offensive is an offense.
being offensive is an offense. And in Scotland, they also, I don't remember the guy's name, but they arrested a guy because he taught his dog to do a Zig Heil, and so
Yeah.
that and I'm like, well, you should arrest the dog. The dog is the is the problem here. It's an
and I
anti-Semitic
saw
dog.
I saw the bit that they were trying to do there, and actually the bit was, it was kind of like it was supposed to be an obnoxious joke, and it was. But yeah, I mean, like the idea that you could get arrested for that is crazy, and that's on the less sympathetic kind of side of stuff that will get you arrested. And I point out, by the way, Red Scare 1, which was 1919 to 1921. And it was the also a big part of it was the Palmer raids, which was sort of cracking down on anarchist slash communist groups after there was a bombing campaign across the country, which people kind of tend to elide over that fact. And it involved the arrest of about, I think, 4,000, 5,000 people. And meanwhile, between 2015 and 2016 in Britain, you're talking about decidedly more than that actually arrested for comments on the interwebs, and that's scary.
Yeah. Well, why don't we do this? I want to ask you one final big question, and then if you're up for it, I want to do maybe 5 minutes of a lightning round where I'm just going to ask you to kind of define terms that I found interesting in the book.
Sure.
Last question for you. When you were last on this program a few years ago, as I recall, you thought that the era that we're living in is very akin to the Victorian era.
Yes.
And I'm totally coining sweater vest Maoism. Feel free to use that, but credit me. But in reading your book, it almost seemed to me that it was like we should think of America as just a really bad debate class.
Yeah.
Is a Victorian and a bad debate class? Like, what should my mental model be moving forward in terms of how I look at cancel culture?
It's one of those things where the fact that people have this kind of conception of history repeating does sometimes frustrate me because it doesn't repeat. It barely rhymes. There are themes that are similar though, and I do make the argument that if you're looking for a comparison, the best is actually Victorianism because most other mass censorship incidents in history involve a national security threat. They involve like an actual external threat, and sometimes it's very real. I have to point out in the Red Scare 2, for example, that there really were British and American spies who gave Super Hitler Stalin the bomb much faster than he would have gotten otherwise. Like that's very well established, even though people like to pretend it's not.
Mm-hmm.
There was a reason to be freaked out. Meanwhile, Sedition Act, like they thought that there was going to be war for France, and this experiment was going to end early. They When it comes, like I mentioned, the Palmer raids, for example, like there was a bombing campaign, across the country. That's the normal situation for mass censorship events. None of that applied in the Victorian era. The Victorian era was about going after immoral speech, and it was there was a sort of middle class element to it, but it was largely sort of an upper class kind of educated movement to sort of purify and make the country less obscene, to
Yeah.
involve less indecency. And I honestly think that that's the best parallel, because cancel culture is largely an upper class movement. It's not in response to a national security threat. It is about ideas of purity. It is about ideas of propriety. Honestly, like a lot of times, even though they don't like to call it this, a lot of PC, for example, is about very strongly held beliefs on what politeness is, effectively, and a sort of mandatory, vicious kind of politeness. Like my mother's British. She wasn't mean about it, but definitely had a lot of experience with, like, the polite, be polite or die, kind of
Right.
attitudes. So I think it's the best parallel, but I do think at the same time, it was that the ways it's not similar is that was overwhelmingly about sexual expression, whereas that's an element, certainly, in cancel culture today, but it's harming institutions that we're supposed to rely on for knowledge producing, and that's a devastating problem for our ability to produce knowledge.
That is a brilliant take. You've converted me. We're living in a new Victorian era. I think the parallels are actually quite striking when you put it that way. I've got a lot of friends where um, I'm going to step on some stuff here. Hailing from Oklahoma, I know what religion looks like, and when I go to New York, where I have many friends that I love, I'm just like, oh, I'm talking to Blue Team Southern Baptist. Okay,
Yeah.
like I know how to navigate this. You're a Blue Team Southern Baptist because I grew up with Southern Baptist in Oklahoma. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means, my God, you've got a lot of bear traps I have to be careful about stepping in that I don't care about. And the kind of it is a top down elite institutions doing that kind of thing. When I hang out with my working class friends in Scotland, or when I hang out with ranch dudes in Oklahoma, this is not conversations that we're having. It's from people that know where Sarah Lawrence Jessica College is located. I assume it's on the East Coast. I don't know. And that kind of militant politeness makes sense. All right. Well, I'll throw some lightning rounds or some quick terms at you. You don't have to spend too much time on them. I just want to know what they mean. What is underdogging?
Oh, underdogging is essentially the idea of being in a battle where you're saying, I'm more of the underdog, you're not the underdog. And I find this particularly ironic in a lot of these elite colleges, because again, cancel culture is overwhelmingly concentrated in elite colleges, and that's very clear from the data. The most influential schools in the country, even though don't really think that they should be. And a lot of the battle is to figure out who's really representing the underdog, because that's kind of assumed, like, who wins. And
Right.
there sometimes is something kind of funny about the fact that schools that actually educate more students from the 1% than the bottom 50 or 60%. This is a real stat. Can ever portray themselves as either being or standing up for the underdog.
Okay, great. What is offense archaeology?
Offense archaeology, not my term. A lot of people have read this and be like, "Oh, what a great term you came up with." No. This is absolutely not a term we came up with. It's the idea of going into someone's, like, old tweets, or or to MySpace, for example, and that really does happen, to find that they said offensive things, and then try to cancel them now, even if the thing at the time was considered acceptable or no biggie, to basically say, "Ooh, you made a homophobic joke in 1993, like, you're in trouble." Actually, the real case I'm thinking of is worse than this. It's a guy who wrote an article that women shouldn't be in the military in the 80s. And he got canceled from a board a couple of years ago, because that came out, even though he'd changed his mind and apologized for it. Like, that's offense archaeology.
I don't think people quite realize how little you have to go back to have the whole culture be at a very, like, the Democratic Party officially endorsed gay marriage in the year of our Lord 2008.
Hmm.
While I was in college and prior to college, both major parties were opposed to gay marriage. And it was just a question of whether you kind of did a mealy mouth states' rights thing or what. But like, yeah, that's opinions evolve, and that's good, because if they don't evolve, you never have a reason. Like, if you're going to get punished for anything you said and there's no way to go, well, actually, I regret that opinion, I've grown, and so on and so forth, you'll just keep doing it. But I digress. What is citation justice?
Citation justice is the idea that essentially you can win a victory for underrepresented scholars by disproportionately citing their work. And that, I don't know if that sounds appealing. Maybe it sounds appealing to some people, but it's kind of like, no, that's not the way academia is supposed to work. You're supposed to, cite whoever you think is the most accurate, regardless of what their identity is. So
Well,
it's
and like rigorously oppose, or like rigorously attack ideas as an idea in order to, constantly be rebuilding the infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. You're not just trying to weight it for a particular group. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I personally think it goes against the canons of what academia is supposed to look like.
Yeah. Schismogenesis.
Oh, schismogenesis. That is a term that I became familiar with from David, the guy who wrote the beginning of everything, David Graeber or something like that. But it's a term that essentially people define themselves in opposition to another group. That essentially, like, if you're from a town in Ohio, you're like, I know who I am. I know I'm not you.
Yeah.
And I feel like we have a lot of schismogenesis where people are sort of defining themselves by their opponent, more or less.
I think I need to add that term to my to my rhetorical knapsack there. Schismogenesis, defining yourself in opposition to somebody else. Scott Lincecum, who's I think at Cato or the Dispatch, maybe both, he said about half of blue team hates markets and about half of red team hates blue team. And I was like, wow, that right there is the most shrewd analysis of American politics that you could look at. Okay, well, Greg, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Once again, the book is The Canceling of the American Mind. Cancel Culture Undermines Trust, Destroys Institutions, and Threatens Us All, but there is a solution. You can find that on Fire's website or Amazon or wherever you get it. I have a website, mightyheaton.com/featured, where you can find that book and all of the books discussed on the program. Greg, I enjoyed your book. I think you're doing the Lord's work. I hope you get more Playboy awards, and it was a pleasure to talk to you again.
Pleasure chatting with you as well.
All right, and that will